For centuries, Viking crews crossed some of the most dangerous waters on Earth. They sailed the North Sea and the North Atlantic in open vessels, exposed to freezing wind, salt spray, and sudden storms. These journeys were not measured in hours or days, but in weeks, sometimes months, spent far from land, far from shelter, and far from warmth. Unlike later ships, Viking longships offered no enclosed cabins and no permanent source of heat. There were no roaring hearths and no thick walls to block the cold. Life aboard unfolded entirely in the open, where icy wind and seawater were constant companions, and where the ocean itself could draw heat from the body with relentless efficiency. Yet despite these conditions, Viking sailors endured. Again and again, longships pushed across cold and unpredictable seas, carrying warriors, traders, and settlers over vast distances. Crews reached distant shores in Britain, Iceland, Greenland, and beyond, often arriving strong enough to fight, work, or build almost immediately upon landfall. How this was possible has long fascinated historians. So let's explore life aboard a Viking longship in cold conditions, and examine how these ships were designed for northern waters, how crews dressed and provisioned themselves, and how daily routines helped protect against exposure, fatigue, and cold. Survival at sea was not a matter of comfort, but of preparation, cooperation, and accumulated experience. The Viking longship was more than a vessel for travel. It functioned as a carefully balanced system, shaped by generations of seafaring knowledge. Every detail, from the overlapping planks of the hull to the organization of the crew, played a role in enduring the icy sea. By understanding how Vikings lived aboard their ships, it becomes possible to glimpse a world where endurance was expected, where resilience was learned early, reinforced daily, and tested constantly by wind, water, and cold. The Viking longship was not designed for comfort. It was designed for survival. Every element of its construction reflected the realities of northern seas, where weather could change without warning and exposure to cold water posed a constant threat. Long before a voyage began, survival was already built into the ship itself. At the heart of the longship's design was its hull. Viking shipbuilders used a method known as clinker construction, in which wooden planks overlapped one another along the sides of the vessel. Rather than forming a rigid shell, this overlapping structure allowed the hull to flex as it moved through rough water. When waves struck the ship, the hull absorbed the force instead of resisting it, reducing the risk of damage in heavy seas. This flexibility was critical in cold environments. In icy waters, a damaged hull could quickly become fatal. A cracked plank or broken seam would allow freezing seawater to flood the ship, rapidly draining body heat and endangering the entire crew. The longship's ability to bend and move with the sea helped prevent these failures, increasing both durability and safety. The shape of the longship also played a vital role in survival. Long and narrow, with a shallow draft, it sat lightly on the surface of the water. This allowed it to move quickly and efficiently, even against wind and current. Speed was not only a tactical advantage, it was also a form of protection. The faster a ship could travel, the less time its crew spent exposed to cold, damp conditions. Unlike later sailing vessels, Viking longships had no deep hull and no enclosed decks. The open design reduced weight and allowed crews to respond quickly to changing conditions. Oars could be deployed or lifted with ease, and sails could be adjusted rapidly as wind shifted. This responsiveness gave Viking sailors greater control over their environment, even in difficult weather. However, the open deck also meant constant exposure. Wind swept freely across the ship, carrying spray that soaked clothing and equipment. Rain and snow fell directly onto the deck, accumulating beneath the feet of the crew. There was no true shelter from the elements, only partial protection created through careful use of the ship's equipment. Temporary coverings offered limited relief. During long voyages, Crews sometimes erected simple awnings made from woolen cloth or sail material. These coverings were supported by wooden frames and provided modest protection from rain and wind. They were not permanent structures and could be removed quickly when conditions demanded open visibility or rapid movement. These shelters were often reserved for supplies, injured crew members, or essential equipment rather than for general comfort. Space aboard a longship was always limited, and survival took priority over rest. Even under an awning, cold air remained trapped close to the deck, and dampness was impossible to avoid. The materials used to build the longship further reflected its northern purpose. Oak was commonly used for planking due to its strength and resistance to splitting. Pine and other softwoods were used where flexibility was required. Iron rivets held the overlapping planks together, allowing the ship to remain strong while still retaining its ability to flex. Wood was sealed with tar to protect it from water. This tar, made from pine resin, helped slow the absorption of moisture and reduced the risk of rot. The smell of tar would have been ever present aboard the ship, mixing with the scent of salt air and wet wood. It was the smell of preservation and survival. The deck itself was not a solid sealed surface. Removable planks rested above the bilge, allowing water that entered the ship to collect below. Crew members regularly bailed out this water using buckets or scoops, a necessary task that became more urgent in cold conditions. Standing water increased humidity, soaked footwear, and accelerated heat loss. Despite these challenges, the longship remained remarkably seaworthy. Its low profile reduced resistance to wind, making it less likely to be overwhelmed by sudden gusts. The curved prow and stern helped cut through waves rather than crashing into them, smoothing the ship's motion and reducing strain on both vessel and crew. The mast and sail were equally important to survival. Viking sails were typically made from wool, a material that retained strength even when wet. These sails were heavy and required constant attention, but they allowed ships to travel long distances without exhausting the crew through constant rowing. When winds were favorable, sails reduced physical strain and conserved energy. When winds failed or became dangerous, the mast could be lowered and secured, allowing the crew to rely on oars alone. This flexibility ensured that the ship could continue moving under a wide range of conditions. Storage aboard the longship was carefully organized. Supplies, weapons, and personal belongings were kept in chests that also served as seating for the crew. These chests helped keep essential items elevated above standing water and provided limited insulation from the cold deck. Shields were often hung along the sides of the ship, forming a partial barrier against wind and spray. While primarily defensive tools, they also served a practical purpose at sea. Their placement helped reduce exposure and created a narrow zone of relative shelter along the benches where the crew sat. Every feature of the longship reflected a balance between necessity and limitation. There was no excess space and no unnecessary weight. Each element served multiple functions, contributing to both movement and survival. In cold northern waters, this balance was essential. A heavier ship would have moved more slowly and consumed more energy. A lighter ship risked damage and instability. The longship occupied a careful middle ground, shaped by generations of experience and repeated exposure to harsh conditions. By the time a Viking longship left shore, it was already a tested design. Its builders understood the demands of icy seas, and its crews trusted the vessel beneath their feet. Survival did not depend on comfort or protection from the environment, but on cooperation between human skill and wooden hull. As the ship continued across open water, the longship itself became a constant presence. It was shelter, transport, and lifeline combined. In the absence of fire and walls, it was this carefully engineered vessel that made survival possible on the cold and restless sea. While the longship itself provided the foundation for survival, It was the crew who transformed the vessel into a living system. In cold northern waters, endurance depended not only on design, but on human organization, shared labor, and constant movement. A Viking longship typically carried between 20 and 60 people, depending on its size and purpose. These crews lived in extremely close quarters, seated along narrow benches that lined the length of the ship. There was little separation between individuals and no private space. Every movement was shared, every task performed in view of others. This closeness was not incidental. It was essential. Human bodies generated heat, and in the absence of fire, that heat became one of the most reliable defenses against the cold. Sitting shoulder to shoulder along the benches helped conserve warmth, especially during long hours of exposure to wind and spray. At sea, isolation was not only impractical but dangerous. Daily life aboard the ship was defined by work. Rowing, adjusting sails, steering, and maintaining balance required constant effort. Even when the ship was under sail, crew members remained active, ready to respond to changes in wind or sea conditions. This steady movement helped maintain circulation and body temperature, reducing the risk of cold-related injuries. Rowing in particular played a central role. Longships relied on coordinated rowing during calm weather, narrow passages, or moments when precise control was required. The physical exertion generated heat throughout the body, offering temporary relief from the cold. Though exhausting, rowing was preferable to remaining still in freezing conditions. Work aboard the ship followed a rhythm shaped by necessity rather than comfort. Tasks were rotated to prevent exhaustion, and experienced sailors monitored the condition of the crew closely. Fatigue, numbness, and loss of coordination were early signs of cold exposure, and ignoring them could have serious consequences. Leadership aboard a longship was practical and direct. Decisions were made quickly, often based on experience rather than formal hierarchy. While captains and navigators held authority, survival depended on cooperation rather than command alone. Each person understood their role and the importance of performing it without delay. Clothing was another critical element of human survival. Viking sailors relied heavily on wool garments worn in layers. Wool retained heat even when damp, making it far more effective than plant-based fabrics in cold and wet conditions. Undergarments were worn close to the skin, with heavier wool tunics and cloaks layered on top. Leather and animal hides added protection from wind and spray. Fur-lined cloaks and caps helped reduce heat loss from exposed areas such as the head and shoulders. These materials were heavy and often stiff when wet, but they provided vital insulation against cold air and water. Footwear was particularly vulnerable. Shoes and boots made from leather absorbed moisture easily, and wet feet were a constant problem aboard the ship. Sailors attempted to manage this by changing footwear when possible, and by elevating their feet off the deck using chests or spare gear. Even so, cold and damp conditions were unavoidable. Hands were kept as warm as possible through movement and simple coverings. Thick gloves limited dexterity and were not always practical, so sailors often relied on frequent motion to maintain circulation. Tasks were performed quickly, minimizing exposure whenever possible. Beyond physical measures, social organization played a major role in endurance. Crews functioned as tightly bonded groups, often drawn from the same community or region. Shared background and familiarity helped maintain trust under difficult conditions. Cooperation was not optional. It was the basis of survival. Silence was common aboard the ship, especially during long stretches at sea. Wind and waves dominated the soundscape, leaving little room for conversation. When voices did rise, they were usually purposeful, focused on tasks or coordination. Excess movement and unnecessary speech were avoided to conserve energy. Despite the harshness of life at sea, moments of connection did exist. Short exchanges, shared glances, and simple gestures reinforced morale. These small interactions helped sustain the group through long periods of discomfort and fatigue. The absence of fire required constant awareness. Without a heat source, sailors relied on maintaining dryness and motion. Wet clothing was dangerous, and exposure to cold spray was managed carefully. Sailors positioned themselves to reduce wind impact and used shields and equipment to create partial barriers where possible. When conditions worsened, the crew adjusted their behavior accordingly. Movement increased, tasks were redistributed, and exposure was minimized. Experienced sailors recognized the signs of worsening weather long before it became obvious, allowing them to prepare in advance. Endurance at sea was cumulative. Each day tested the body and mind, and recovery was limited. Sleep was fragmented, meals were simple, and rest was often interrupted. Yet Viking crews accepted these conditions as part of life on the water. Hardship was expected, not exceptional. Knowledge played a key role in this acceptance. Skills were learned early and reinforced through experience. Sailors understood how their bodies reacted to cold and how to manage their energy accordingly. This familiarity reduced panic and helped maintain focus during difficult moments. The crew itself became the ship's most adaptable resource. When equipment failed or conditions changed, human effort compensated. Sailors adjusted sails by hand, bailed water continuously, and shifted positions to maintain balance. Flexibility and responsiveness defined life aboard the Longship. In this environment, survival was not achieved through individual strength alone. It depended on collective endurance. Each person contributed to the stability and warmth of the group, and each relied on others in return. As the Longship pressed onward across cold waters, it was the crew who sustained its journey. Their movement, discipline, and shared resilience transformed an exposed wooden vessel into a functioning system of survival. In the absence of shelter and fire, human cooperation became the most reliable source of warmth and stability on the icy sea. Life aboard a Viking longship was demanding, and maintaining strength was essential to survival. In the absence of heat and with constant exposure to wind and spray, the body required high energy to keep functioning. Food and water were central to this endurance, and every meal was a carefully considered part of the journey. Viking crews carried provisions that were both practical and durable. Fresh food was scarce on long voyages, so sailors relied heavily on preserved items. Dried fish and meat were staples, offering concentrated protein that could be stored for weeks without spoiling. Hardtack, a type of simple biscuit made from flour and water, provided long-lasting carbohydrates, while cheese and butter supplied essential fats. These high-calorie foods were not meant to delight the palate. Their purpose was fuel. Each bite contributed directly to the body's ability to generate heat and maintain strength. A sailor who skipped meals or received insufficient calories risked fatigue and hypothermia, particularly during prolonged exposure to wind and icy water. Preserving these provisions required attention. Salted fish or meat was packed tightly in barrels or chests to protect it from moisture and contamination. Hardtack was stored in boxes that kept it dry, sometimes wrapped in cloth or leather. Despite these precautions, dampness and leakage were constant threats, and sailors had to remain vigilant to prevent spoilage. Fresh water presented another challenge. The crew needed water for drinking, cooking, and limited cleaning, but carrying large quantities was difficult. Vikings typically stored water in skins made from animal hides. These containers were durable but prone to leakage if not properly maintained. Water was rationed carefully, and consumption was balanced against the risk of dehydration in cold weather. Dehydration could be insidious in cold conditions. The body loses moisture through breath and sweat, even when temperatures are low. Sailors working at oars or adjusting sails expended significant energy, increasing the need for fluid intake. Careful planning and discipline in drinking routines were essential to prevent fatigue and maintain endurance. Cooking aboard the Longship was limited by both space and safety concerns. Open flames on a wooden vessel posed serious risk. A small fire could be used for heating or stewing, but it was typically restricted to calm conditions, or when the ship was beached. Pots were often metal and small, producing modest meals quickly to minimize heat loss and reduce the risk of accidents. Instead of relying on cooking, crews often ate their provisions cold or prepared them with minimal heating. Cheese and butter could be consumed directly. Dried fish was eaten as it was, and hardtack provided carbohydrates without preparation. This approach reduced exposure to fire hazards while ensuring the crew remained nourished. Meals were often communal. Food was distributed from central storage areas, with each sailor receiving rations that reflected both need and status. The distribution process was practical, designed to sustain the crew rather than provide luxury. Even in these brief moments of relative comfort, sailors remained vigilant, aware of the cold air and the movement of the ship beneath them. The timing of meals followed the rhythm of the voyage. Early morning often began with cold provisions, followed by more substantial rations during periods of activity. Heavy labor increased caloric needs, and meals were adjusted accordingly. Energy management was not optional. It was a survival strategy. Food also served a secondary purpose: morale. Sustaining a crew psychologically was as important as physical endurance. Familiar tastes, however simple, provided comfort and a sense of stability in an otherwise harsh and unpredictable environment. Shared meals reinforced the communal bonds essential to functioning at sea. In addition to providing fuel, certain provisions offered protection against illness. Salted and dried foods reduced the risk of bacterial contamination, while fermented items, when available, contributed beneficial nutrients. Knowledge of these methods was passed down through generations, reflecting an understanding of nutrition and preservation beyond immediate survival. The process of preparing and consuming food was itself an exercise in adaptation. Sailors developed techniques for opening containers, sharing portions, and managing limited equipment. Each meal involved coordination, ensuring that the entire crew received sustenance while minimizing exposure to cold and wet conditions. Water management extended beyond drinking. It was used sparingly for cleaning utensils or washing when necessary, often with limited availability. Rainwater was occasionally collected to supplement stored supplies, though it was unreliable. The careful balance between hydration and rationing was another measure of discipline aboard the Longship. Caloric intake was closely linked to the physical demands of life at sea. Rowing, adjusting sails, and constant vigilance required high energy expenditure. The simplest miscalculation could leave a sailor weak, chilled, or unable to perform critical tasks. This relationship between nutrition and survival was understood instinctively by experienced crews. The danger of overexertion was real. Sailors were trained to pace themselves, to alternate labor and short rests, and to consume food and water strategically. These routines created a predictable structure that helped mitigate the unpredictable nature of the sea and the weather. Food storage, preparation, and consumption were continuous concerns. Every item aboard the ship had multiple purposes, and nothing could be wasted. Supplies were accounted for daily, ensuring that rations lasted for the duration of the voyage. This attention to detail exemplified the practical intelligence required for survival. In extreme conditions, meals could be limited to the bare minimum. Frostbite, exhaustion, and stormy seas made preparation difficult, yet crews adapted. Techniques such as consuming high-fat items first or eating smaller, frequent portions helped maintain energy without overtaxing the body. Even the act of eating was influenced by the environment. Sitting on wet benches or uneven surfaces, sailors balanced food and utensils carefully. Wind and spray made every action more challenging, yet discipline and practice allowed the crew to sustain themselves efficiently. Food and water, in combination with clothing and human effort, formed a critical triad of survival. Without proper nourishment, even the best clothing and strongest muscles could not prevent hypothermia. The Longship alone was insufficient. It was the integration of vessel, crew, and provisions that enabled life in icy northern seas. Sustenance aboard a Viking longship was a study in adaptation. High-calorie preserved foods, careful water management, and minimal cooking techniques were designed not for comfort but for endurance. Every meal supported both physical and psychological survival, allowing crews to continue their voyages across treacherous waters with energy, focus, and resilience. Sleep aboard a Viking longship was far from comfortable, yet it was essential. In a vessel entirely exposed to the elements, resting without warmth or shelter required ingenuity, discipline, and communal cooperation. The ship itself offered no protection beyond its structure, and every night presented challenges of wind, spray, and movement. Sailors used a combination of natural materials and design practicality to create sleeping arrangements that were both functional and as warm as possible under harsh conditions. Animal hides were a primary resource. Sheepskin and bearskin provided thick, insulating layers that could be laid directly on the wooden benches or deck. These hides retained warmth even when slightly damp, creating a barrier between the sailor and the cold, wet wood beneath. Woolen blankets and cloaks were layered over these hides, adding insulation and protection against wind. The Vikings understood the properties of their clothing and bedding, using multiple layers to trap heat efficiently. Wool retained warmth even when wet and allowed for some flexibility in movement during sleep. Sailors would arrange blankets strategically, often tucking them around the sides of their body or covering the head and shoulders to conserve heat. Space was extremely limited. Sailors slept side by side along the benches that ran the length of the ship, and privacy was non-existent. Each person's body heat contributed to the warmth of the group, and huddling together became an essential part of survival. Even small shifts in position had an effect on comfort and warmth. The closeness of the crew created a system in which survival was collective, not individual. Sleeping on a moving vessel posed additional challenges. The longship rose and fell with every wave, and sailors had to adjust constantly to maintain balance. Even in calm seas, the deck was rarely level. Rolling motions and sudden shifts required vigilance, as a careless movement could result in injury or loss of balance. Sailors adapted by placing their bodies strategically along the benches, often bracing against chests, railings, or even shields to reduce motion. Water and spray added another layer of difficulty. Exposure to moisture could penetrate clothing and bedding, and any dampness increased heat loss. Sailors would adjust their position to avoid areas where water collected, and they used shields, tarred cloths, or temporary coverings to reduce direct contact with wind and spray. In extreme weather, crews prioritized positioning over comfort, balancing warmth with safety. Sleeping arrangements were often rotated. Watch systems required certain crew members to remain awake while others rested. These rotations were structured to ensure that the ship remained navigable and that emergencies could be addressed immediately. Those on watch faced the elements directly, often in temperatures well below freezing, while those resting relied on the warmth of layers and the presence of other sailors. Even under ideal conditions, sleep was fragmented. The motion of the ship, the sound of the waves, and the occasional need to adjust equipment prevented extended periods of rest. Vikings adapted by resting in short intervals, conserving energy without allowing fatigue to accumulate. Sleep became a skill as much as a necessity, requiring awareness of the surroundings even while attempting to rest. Shields were often repurposed during sleep. Placed strategically along the sides of the bench or deck, they acted as barriers against wind and spray, providing partial shelter in a constantly exposed environment. They also offered a sense of security, separating the sleeper from potential hazards such as loose equipment or shifting cargo. Personal belongings and provisions influenced sleep as well. Sailors slept close to chests or bundles containing food, tools, or clothing, both to conserve space and to keep essential items accessible. These arrangements allowed for quick access during emergencies, reducing the need to move across a slippery or rocking deck. The crew's communal nature extended to night routines. Sailors shared information about weather, observed one another for signs of cold stress, and coordinated movements to prevent accidents. Even in rest, the group functioned as a unit. Individual survival depended on collective awareness, and vigilance never fully ceased. Environmental conditions dictated additional strategies. In particularly cold or wet weather, sailors might wrap themselves in multiple layers of clothing, use extra hides for insulation, and huddle closer together. When storms intensified, some crews would secure themselves to the benches or to the ship's structure, preventing falls and minimizing the risk of injury. Every adaptation was a response to immediate conditions, honed through experience. Light played a minor but significant role. The Longship had no artificial lighting, except for rare contained fires during calm conditions or when beached. Sailors relied on moonlight, starlight, or the reflection of water to navigate the deck at night. Darkness amplified the need for coordination, as missteps could lead to accidents or exposure. Temperature management was constant. Even in layers, sailors lost heat rapidly when inactive. The solution was a combination of layering, huddling, and intermittent movement. Adjusting position, shifting slightly, or changing posture allowed sailors to maintain circulation. These small motions were critical for sustaining body temperature and preventing cold-related injuries. The act of sleeping was also influenced by the ship's cargo and equipment. Ropes, oars, and supplies were often stowed along the benches or deck, requiring sailors to find clear spaces. Learning to rest without disturbing essential equipment was part of life at sea. Efficiency in sleeping arrangements reflected experience and adaptability. Sailors developed mental strategies to endure difficult nights, accepting discomfort as inevitable, focusing on small tasks such as adjusting clothing or counting waves to regulate breathing helped mitigate stress. Sleep was as much a mental challenge as a physical one, and those who mastered both aspects were better equipped for extended voyages. Seasonal conditions further complicated sleep. Winter voyages brought extreme cold, ice accumulation on the deck, and reduced daylight. Summer voyages introduced long hours of light, requiring adaptation to irregular sleep patterns. Vikings understood these cycles and adjusted their routines to match environmental conditions, balancing the demands of navigation, labor, and rest. Sleeping in shifts ensured that someone was always alert. Watches rotated in intervals, often several hours each. Those resting had to be aware that they could be called to action at any moment, whether to adjust sails, bail water, or respond to changing weather. This system maintained operational efficiency while allowing periods of recovery. While sleeping arrangements were austere, they were effective. Knowledge of how to layer clothing, position the body, and coordinate with others made extended rest possible even under extreme conditions. Hides, blankets, shields, and strategic movement created an environment in which survival could continue despite constant exposure. The rhythm of life aboard the Longship was structured yet adaptable. Sleep was planned around work, weather, and navigation. Meals, shifts, and rest were interwoven, creating a continuous cycle that allowed the crew to endure weeks at sea. This structure reduced the unpredictability of exposure and created a sense of order amidst challenging conditions. Sailors often took advantage of calm periods to maximize rest. During still nights, when the wind died and waves slowed, longer stretches of sleep became possible. These moments were rare and valued, providing the crew with a chance to recover from physical exertion and cold stress. In more extreme conditions, sleeping strategies became more creative. Sailors might interlock bodies to share warmth more efficiently, or tuck themselves beneath protective layers of sails or cloths. Even in these improvised arrangements, the principles of insulation, layering, and communal warmth remain central. Despite the challenges, the act of sleeping aboard a Viking longship was routine. Generations of sailors had refined the practices that balanced warmth, safety, and rest. What might appear uncomfortable or harsh to an outsider was understood and accepted as part of life at sea. Sleep, like work, was a component of survival. It was never luxurious, never guaranteed, yet it was essential. Every strategy employed, every adjustment made, was designed to sustain the crew through long nights, harsh conditions, and the relentless rhythm of the northern seas. By observing these practices, it becomes clear that endurance at sea was not simply a matter of physical strength. Knowledge, preparation, cooperation, and adaptability were equally important. Sleeping arrangements were part of a larger system of survival, integrating vessel, crew, clothing, and environment into a functional whole. In this way, even in the coldest, roughest waters, the Vikings found a method to rest. They maintained energy, preserved warmth, and supported one another. The ship became more than wood and sail. It became a framework for life, a structure in which sleep was possible despite constant exposure to wind, water, and cold. Through these practices, the crew was able to sustain itself across weeks at sea. Nights passed with discipline, adaptation, and shared effort. Sleep became another tool in the complex system that allowed survival, enabling the Vikings to endure one of the harshest environments faced by any seafaring culture. Life aboard a Viking longship demanded more than physical endurance. The mind faced constant challenges: monotony, isolation, uncertainty, and the relentless cold. Yet it was the sailors' ability to adapt psychologically, to find structure and meaning amid the harsh conditions, that allowed them to endure weeks, sometimes months, at sea. Daily life on the ship was punctuated by both work and the quiet moments in between. When storms abated and tasks were complete, the crew found ways to occupy themselves and maintain morale. Storytelling was central to these moments. Tales of past voyages, heroic ancestors, or mythic figures provided both entertainment and guidance. These narratives reinforced cultural identity, passed down survival strategies, and offered reassurance in an unpredictable environment. Storytelling also gave a sense of continuity, connecting sailors to generations of seafarers who had faced similar dangers. Music and singing played a complementary role. Simple melodies sung in unison created rhythm for rowing and lifted spirits during long stretches at sea. Drumming on benches or thumping shields lightly became informal percussion, transforming work into a shared experience. Songs, like stories, were both practical and emotional tools, helping to synchronize activity while offering comfort. Games were another way the crew coped with monotony. Simple contests of dexterity, strategy, or memory allowed sailors to pass time, sharpen focus, and bond with one another. Throwing small objects, racing along the deck, or practicing knot tying under pressure fostered both skill and amusement. Even light-hearted competition had a practical edge, encouraging quick thinking and problem-solving, traits that could prove useful when facing sudden danger. Humor and camaraderie were essential. Sailors relied on small jokes, playful banter, and friendly teasing to maintain morale. These moments relieved tension, reinforced social bonds, and reminded everyone that, despite the cold and the danger, they were still part of a human community. Laughter, even brief, was a psychological lifeline. Observation was another form of mental engagement. Vikings continuously studied the environment not only for navigation, but for subtle signs of change. Patterns in the waves, shapes of ice flows, or the behavior of birds provided information about weather, proximity to land, or currents. These practices engaged the mind and provided a sense of agency. Sailors were not passive victims of the sea, but active participants in understanding and responding to it. Generational knowledge was also central to resilience. Experienced sailors mentored younger crew members, passing down practical skills and advice on coping with cold, managing sleep, and maintaining morale. These lessons often included stories with moral or practical undertones, teaching how to balance caution with initiative, obedience with adaptability, and patience with action. The Longship became a classroom as well as a vessel, and the crew a living network of knowledge. Rituals and personal habits helped sailors maintain a sense of control. Some might polish weapons or tools each evening, arrange belongings neatly, or inspect clothing for wear. These small actions offered reassurance, imposed order, and symbolically protected against chaos. Even minor routines strengthened confidence and created psychological structure amid unpredictability. Shared customs reinforced cohesion. The crew often observed certain practices before meals, after completing tasks, or during shifts at the oars. These customs, though simple, provided continuity and predictability, helping sailors feel anchored when conditions were otherwise unstable. A nod, a shared phrase, or a coordinated chant became markers of unity and reassurance. Mental fortitude also drew on imagination. Sailors visualized distant lands, recounted memories of home, and imagined the warmth of hearths and longhouses left behind. These mental images offered comfort, preserving hope and determination. Such reflections helped bridge the emotional distance imposed by the open sea. Adaptation to monotony was critical. Repetition of rowing, steering, and observing could erode focus or induce despair if left unchallenged. By integrating games, storytelling, and small contests into the day, sailors maintained attention and creativity. Engagement with both practical tasks and recreational activities ensured mental sharpness and emotional balance. Team dynamics also shaped psychological resilience. Leadership was less about authority and more about emotional attunement. Experienced sailors recognized signs of fatigue, stress, or discouragement in others and adjusted tasks or offered encouragement. Peer support became as important as skill, reinforcing the social fabric that enabled the crew to function as a unit. Trust and accountability were essential, and failure to uphold these social bonds could compromise the safety of everyone aboard. Observation extended beyond immediate survival. Crews watched weather patterns, studied the sky, and noted sea conditions to anticipate future challenges. Learning to read subtle cues became a source of empowerment, reducing anxiety and giving a sense of predictability. This continuous mental engagement connected sailors to the environment and strengthened confidence in their collective abilities. Cultural beliefs and rituals also contributed. Some sailors invoked blessings or observed symbolic gestures meant to ensure safe passage. Even small tokens, amulets, or verbal expressions provided psychological comfort. These practices reflected the integration of practical knowledge with cultural identity, reinforcing both mental resilience and cohesion. Sleep, while constrained, was supplemented by these social and recreational practices. Even brief interactions, shared stories, or cooperative games strengthened bonds, making periods of rest more effective. The rhythm of work, play, and storytelling created structure, mitigating the mental strain of prolonged exposure to cold and isolation. Endurance at sea was thus a synthesis of physical effort, preparation, and imaginative engagement. Mental fortitude was cultivated through observation, cultural practice, communal interaction, and creative occupation of time. Emotional coping strategies such as humor, storytelling, and shared rituals allowed the crew to maintain morale and focus, even when conditions were relentless. In this way, survival was a holistic system. The crew's spirit was inseparable from the vessel itself. The Longship provided structure and mobility. The provisions sustained the body, and the social and psychological practices sustained the mind. Together, these elements created an environment in which humans could persist, adapt, and even find moments of satisfaction amid hardship. The stories told aboard the Longship, the games played, and the songs sung were as much tools of endurance as the oars or sails. They strengthened connection, reinforced skills, and maintained hope. They allowed the crew to transform the constant exposure, cold, and monotony into an environment where human ingenuity, culture, and emotion could flourish alongside survival. By observing these practices, it becomes clear that Viking mental resilience was not simply a product of toughness. It was cultivated deliberately, shaped by tradition, experience, and the necessity of cooperation. Endurance at sea was both physical and psychological, an interplay of observation, skill, creativity, and social cohesion. The Longship was alive with human spirit, and that spirit was the force that allowed it to withstand the northern seas. Life aboard a Viking longship was inherently precarious. The cold northern waters, unpredictable weather, and exposed design of the vessel meant that emergencies could arise at any moment. Unlike modern ships, there were no engines to rely on, no advanced navigational instruments, and no rescue services. Survival depended entirely on the crew's preparation, skill, and capacity to respond quickly and effectively. One of the most immediate threats was water ingress. Even a well-built longship could take on water during storms, rough seas, or from simple leaks along the planks. Sailors constantly monitored the hull, listening for the sound of water slapping inside the vessel, or the subtle creaking that might indicate shifting boards. Wooden longships were constructed with overlapping planks, known as clinker-built design, which provided flexibility but required vigilance. Over time, the constant pounding of waves could loosen fastenings or open seams, and crews needed to be ready to act. When a leak was detected, the response was swift. Crew members would gather buckets or wooden scoops, bailing water continuously to prevent accumulation. This task required coordination. While some rowed or adjusted sails to maintain control, others focused entirely on keeping the ship afloat. Bailing was exhausting, often done in freezing spray and driving wind, but it was vital. The sound of steady effort created a working rhythm that allowed the crew to focus on survival rather than panic. Temporary patching was another essential technique. Sailors carried tar, pitch, and spare planks, which could be applied to small leaks in calm moments. These repairs were often improvised. A piece of cloth, soaked in tar, could be pressed against a seam to slow water ingress. Larger gaps required more complex solutions. Sailors might use wedges or wooden plugs to fill cracks temporarily until calmer conditions allowed permanent repair. Ingenuity, patience, and teamwork determined whether these measures were successful. Storms presented a different set of challenges. The longship's speed and flexibility allowed it to ride waves more safely than heavier vessels, but sudden gusts, crashing swells, and icy spray still posed extreme danger. During storms, sails were reduced or lowered completely, and oars were stowed to prevent damage. Crew members secured themselves with ropes or positioned themselves low in the ship to reduce the risk of being swept overboard. Shields were pressed against the rails to provide partial barriers against spray, and every motion was calculated to maintain balance. Navigation during extreme weather required constant vigilance. Visibility could drop to near zero in snow, fog, or heavy rain. Experienced sailors relied on memory of landmarks, observation of currents, and knowledge of prevailing winds. Birds, waves, and the patterns of floating debris were interpreted as subtle cues. Even minor misjudgments could lead to grounding or collisions with unseen hazards. So focus and discipline were maintained under intense stress. Another common emergency involved ice. In the northern seas, floating ice and drifting icebergs created significant hazards. Sailors needed to detect ice early to avoid collisions that could puncture the hull. Observing the movement of ice, listening for the distinctive sounds of cracking floes, and coordinating shifts in rowing or steering were critical. The crew often adjusted course gradually, relying on teamwork and careful observation rather than rapid maneuvers that might destabilize the ship. Medical emergencies were handled with similar pragmatism. Frostbite, cuts, bruises, and minor injuries were common. Sailors carried simple tools and materials for first aid: clean cloths, animal fat, and herbs. Wounds were cleaned and wrapped immediately to prevent infection, while frostbitten hands and feet were gently warmed by contact with body heat and layers of clothing. The close proximity of the crew made monitoring straightforward. Any sailor showing signs of hypothermia or extreme fatigue would be supported by others until recovery was possible. Fire posed a unique challenge. Though dangerous on a wooden ship, contained heat was sometimes necessary during calm periods. A small brazier or metal pot might be used to warm food or water, but these fires were monitored constantly. In the event of sparks or flames reaching sails, ropes, or stored provisions, the crew would act instantly, smothering flames with wet cloths or sand. The threat of fire reinforced discipline and careful attention to every aspect of daily life aboard the Longship. Equipment failure could also escalate into emergency situations. Broken oars, torn sails, or damaged rigging demanded immediate action. Sailors carried spare tools, rope, and small planks to effect temporary repairs. Tasks were divided strategically. Some repaired sails, others adjusted rigging, while the most experienced sailors managed navigation and course correction. Quick improvisation was essential. For example, a torn sail could be lashed together using rope or twine, allowing continued travel until proper repair could be made. Capsizing was a rare but ever-present danger. In extreme weather, or when navigating tight passages, the Longship could roll dangerously. In such cases, the crew's collective experience and coordination were critical. Rowers braced themselves, shifted weight deliberately, and used the oars to stabilize the vessel. Some sailors would throw ropes overboard to steady the ship temporarily, or to provide handholds in case of sudden rolling. Calm, coordinated responses often prevented disaster, turning what could have been a catastrophic event into a managed challenge. Capsized or stranded ships also demanded survival ingenuity. If the ship was pushed onto rocks or shallow water, the crew worked to lighten it by removing cargo, bailing water, and using ropes or wedges to free the hull. Knowledge of tides, currents, and leverage became as critical as physical strength. Every action required careful judgment. A single misstep could damage the vessel further or place the crew in immediate danger. Loss of supplies was another form of emergency. Provisions could be swept overboard, spoiled by water, or consumed faster than planned. Sailors adapted by rationing remaining food and water carefully, supplementing with fish or small game when possible, and improvising storage solutions to protect remaining supplies. Resource management became a test of ingenuity and planning, as every decision directly influenced survival chances. Communication during emergencies was vital. Short, clear calls and hand signals ensured coordinated action even amid storm noise or chaos. Panic could spread quickly, so leaders relied on disciplined instructions and predictable procedures. Experience allowed the crew to anticipate needs, assign roles, and respond with efficiency. Every member knew their function in an emergency, and improvisation worked best when guided by shared understanding and trust. Even minor emergencies reinforced larger lessons about preparation. Regular inspections of the hull, sails, rigging, and equipment were preventive measures, reducing the likelihood of catastrophe. Training drills, passing knowledge between experienced and novice sailors, and maintaining clear routines all contributed to the crew's ability to respond effectively when real emergencies arose. The Longship itself was part of emergency strategy. Its flexibility, low profile, and shallow draft allowed it to ride waves, maneuver around obstacles, and reach shallow waters for safety. However, these advantages required constant attention. Every sailor had to understand the vessel's limitations and adapt their actions to maximize its strengths while mitigating vulnerabilities. Ultimately, emergencies at sea demanded a combination of preparation, improvisation, and teamwork. No single sailor could guarantee safety. Survival was a collective achievement. Success depended on observation, knowledge, skill, and the willingness to act decisively under pressure. From bailing water to repairing sails, navigating ice, or caring for the injured, every response was a measure of ingenuity, endurance, and coordination. In this way, Viking crews transformed crises into challenges that could be managed. Emergencies were not only tests of skill, but opportunities to demonstrate leadership, cooperation, and resilience. The ship, the crew, and the environment formed a dynamic system in which preparedness, adaptability, and collective effort determined life or death. By observing these practices, it becomes clear that Viking survival at sea was not accidental. It required knowledge passed through generations, constant vigilance, and the ability to improvise under extreme pressure. The Longship itself was only part of the equation. The crew's skill, judgment, and courage completed the system. The Viking Longship was more than a vessel. It was a floating home, a sanctuary, and a challenge all at once. Life aboard it demanded constant attention, cooperation, and resilience. Across icy seas, the crew faced bitter winds, freezing spray, and the endless motion of waves. Each day was defined by the struggle to endure, to keep the ship moving, and to maintain warmth in a world without comfort. Yet within this harsh environment, sailors found rhythm, routine, and the strength to carry on. The deck of the Longship offered little protection from the elements. Waves splashed over the sides, cold water soaked clothing, and the wind cut through every layer. Sailors learned to move carefully, balancing each step against the rolling of the ship. Every action, tending the sails, adjusting the oars, repairing boards, was performed with awareness of the cold and the danger it could bring. The sailors' bodies were constantly generating heat through work, and the act of rowing or hauling sails became a means of survival as much as a task of navigation. Sleep was a delicate balance. Sailors huddled together in narrow spaces, sharing body heat, using furs and layered wool for insulation, and sometimes pressing shields against the wind and spray. The motion of the waves made rest challenging, and every shift in position required attention to avoid exhaustion or frostbite. Even in sleep, the crew remained attuned to the ship's rhythm, ready to respond to sudden changes in weather or emergencies that could arise without warning. Meals were simple but essential to endurance. Calorie-rich foods such as salted fish, dried meat, hard bread, and cheese were rationed carefully. Water was precious, and each sip was conserved. Eating together offered more than nourishment. It reinforced structure, comfort, and camaraderie. Every shared meal, every communal moment, strengthened bonds that were crucial for surviving the relentless cold and the isolation of the open sea. The crew's mental and emotional life was intertwined with survival. Storytelling, songs, and quiet games offered relief from monotony and stress. Music and chants created rhythm during work, while games or contests of skill fostered engagement and cooperation. Even brief moments of laughter or camaraderie helped sailors endure the long hours in the wind and spray. Life aboard the Longship demanded ingenuity not only in physical tasks, but in maintaining morale and human connection. Observation was vital to life on the ship. Sailors watched the sky, currents, ice flows, and wildlife for clues about weather and hazards. Drifting ice or changing waves signaled potential danger, and early detection could prevent disaster. Reading these signs required focus, knowledge, and experience. Attention to the environment provided a sense of control in conditions that could otherwise feel chaotic and unforgiving. The Longship itself played a central role in survival. Its flexible hull allowed it to ride waves without breaking, while its shallow draft let it approach calm waters or avoid obstacles. The ship was a system that worked with the crew rather than against them. Every task, from adjusting sails to maintaining the hull, was part of a continuous effort to endure the cold, the waves, and the unpredictable northern weather. Even small routines had significance. Inspecting ropes, arranging furs for sleeping, or checking food stores created structure in the endless routine. These actions were more than practical. They offered psychological comfort, a sense of mastery over an environment defined by cold and motion. The crew relied on routine to manage both the body and the mind, reinforcing endurance and alertness. In reflection, the story of the Longship is the story of life on the ship. It is about enduring the cold, navigating storms, sharing warmth, and maintaining vigilance. It is about a community bound together by work, routine, and mutual dependence. The Longship carried sailors through the harshest seas, but it was the crew's skill, endurance, and spirit that ensured survival. The culmination of all these things led to an understanding of surviving the cold, icy seas as Vikings.